problems here is the assumption that this is like every other vaccine we've ever seen, and it's not.
That was Dr. Robert Malone, the inventor of the mRNA vaccine technology. There's a lot of talk going around at the moment about Pfizer's novel delivery method, this mRNA technique, and I thought you'd appreciate hearing from the inventor of that technology. This incredible tech is actually coming from his patents dating back as far as 1989, a long time ago, when he was so far ahead of his time that it is now only 30 years later that the world is turning to mucosal mRNA vaccine delivery techniques. His incredible discovery back then in the late 80s was that it is possible to transfect mRNA packages into a cell when it's protected by a little ball of fat, a little liposomal package. And once it gets into the cell, it can force that cell to produce certain proteins all on its own. It's reprogramming that cell to produce that protein. And that, of course, is exactly how our Pfizer vaccines work.
What these vaccines do is they encode spike protein alone so that the immune system will learn to recognize spike protein and will catch it quickly when one is confronted with COVID. But the spike protein itself, we now know, is very dangerous. It's cytotoxic. Is that a fair description?
More than fair, and I alerted the FDA about this risk months and months and months ago. And their determination was
it's a harmless spike protein.
That they didn't think that was sufficient documentation of the risk that spike was biologically active.
Right. Okay, they did not believe the spike was biologically active. So that was the big mistake.
We now know the spike protein is very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Is biologically
We also know, so if it was very dangerous, but it did what the brochure on these vaccines says it should do, which is lodge in the membrane of the cells that are doing the transcribing, it would be a lot less destructive.
So with our cells now being taught on how to make this spike protein all on their own, I've always been interested to know exactly where in the body these lipid packages go to. Where do they coagulate? Where do they accumulate the most? And therefore, which parts of our body, which cells are the ones cranking out the spike proteins, and whether or not the location in the body of those concentrations correlates at all, if at all, with some of the adverse events being reported.
We have no problems at all with mRNA vaccines.
Right.
It's just this particular vaccine, because of the spike protein and because it cleaves off the cell and it goes throughout your body and your brain, your heart, and anywhere, that you can have these symptoms that are so varied, whether it's a 16-year-old who can't talk or see 48 hours after injection, or someone whose, handshakes, or someone who's, my carpet cleaner, Tim, he's like disabled now. He's lost $30,000 in terms of his costs, and he's going in for an epidural because he's in such pain. And so these side effects, the victims of this vaccine, they're not being able to tell their story at the press because, Tim says, I try to tell my story and the press ignores him.
A Freedom of Information request has been successful in Japan, where data from Pfizer has now been released, showing this here in this graph that shows the biodistribution of those lipid nanoparticles that the mRNA packets are safely carried into the cells. Now, this finally answers my question. Where exactly does this mRNA delivery system concentrate in the body? And it seems initially it's in the blood plasma, which is quite normal. Expected at least, but then we see long-term that accumulation increases in the bone marrow, but especially and dominantly in the ovaries.
They were aware that there was a risk of a spike being biologically active and having adverse events if it did not stay stuck to the cells that were transfected, that got the RNA and made it. Okay, and they used a genetic engineering method of putting a transmembrane domain on it to ensure that it stayed anchored and stayed put. And they did limited non-clinical studies to say, looks like it stays stuck. Right. We engineered it to stay stuck.
They did,
and they published that. That's generally not good enough in a non-clinical data package. So before we get a product released to use in humans, in the normal situation where we're not in a rush, we have some really rigorous tests that have to be done in animals. And revealing that spike gets cleaved off of expressed cells and becomes free is something that absolutely should have been known and understood well before this ever gotten put into humans. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm a regulatory professional, and I do talk to the FDA, and I have good friends there in senior positions. They were aware back when we were doing randomized clinical trials that these adverse events were occurring. Many of them were oddly delayed and atypical for a vaccine trial. This is totally new technology, and that kind of gets at the core. I think one of our problems here is the assumption that this is like every other vaccine we've ever seen, and it's not.
Unfortunately, a lot of this information is difficult to come by. Surveilling and detecting adverse events seems to be the sticky situation here around the vaccine rollout. Censorship in particular is coming undone. And although it has taken a bit of time and potentially at great expense to humanity, it is extremely difficult to suppress data and inquiring minds for very long. And so right now we have these questions being asked by very mainstream people.
By implementing censoring, what we're doing is making it so that signals can't be detected.
Yeah.
People's voices can't be heard. And I'm of the opinion that we have to have free and open discussion, and we have to have full disclosure of risks. And when you censor that, you cannot have that.
It changes everybody's mindset into believing it's safe and effective. And when you have that, you don't report these adverse events as being associated with it because so when a doctor sees a miscarriage and says, "I've never seen a baby like this in my entire career," where she's never seen anything like it, and the woman was vaccinated a month ago, and she's 25 weeks pregnant. When you have that sort of thing, the doctor says, well, it can't be the vaccine because the vaccine is safe. Wow. And so they say, well, it must be a genetic defect. And they report it as a genetic defect, and they don't even report it into the VAERS system. So we never see any of these safety signals because everybody is trained to think that it's safe. It couldn't have been the vaccine.
So that's this groupthink problem. And I think it is a real problem.
All of this is to say that those of us who are very pro-vaccination are being forced to reckon with some very uncomfortable truths about this particular moment in our biomedical history. Because if we are to be led by the data, as we should be, we can no longer ignore the data and the evidence that may have sounded fringe a few months ago, but now is being explored and publicly backed by the most mainstream and most credible of experts and scientists in this field. So if you